Will Brother Thomas's secret healing ministry save his village, or will fear and superstition destroy everything he holds dear? Stay with us through this epic tale of faith, courage, and the power of compassion to transform kingdoms. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell. You won't want to miss how this incredible story unfolds. The autumn mist clung to the cobblestones of Millhaven like the breath of the dying, and Brother Thomas pulled his rough woolen hood deeper over his tonsured head as he made his way through the narrow streets. The plague had come to their village 3 moons past, arriving with a merchant caravan from the southern ports, and since then the very air seemed poisoned with grief and fear. Thomas pressed his calloused hands against the leather satchel beneath his brown habit, feeling the precious glass vials within clink softly against one another. Each contained a carefully prepared tincture of herbs he had discovered in the ancient medical texts hidden deep within the monastery's library, texts written in Latin and Greek by physicians whose names had been forgotten by all save God. The young monk had spent countless nights by candlelight, translating the archaic remedies and experimenting with different combinations of wolfsbane, elderflower, and the rare bloodroot that grew wild in the forest beyond the abbey walls. His superior, Abbot Cornelius, had forbidden such practices, declaring that the pestilence was God's judgment upon a sinful world, and that only prayer and penance could turn aside the Almighty's wrath. But Thomas had seen too many small coffins carried from the village, too many mothers weeping over children whose fever-bright eyes had dimmed to lifeless glass, too many fathers standing hollow-eyed at fresh graves, their calloused hands hanging useless at their sides. If God had given him the knowledge to heal, surely it was meant to be used. The first house on his clandestine route belonged to Willem the Cooper, whose 7-year-old daughter Margot lay dying in the loft above her father's workshop. Thomas had been visiting the child for a fortnight now, always after Compline when the village slept and the watchmen dozed at their posts. Each night, he climbed the wooden ladder to where the girl burned with fever, her golden hair matted with sweat, her breathing shallow and labored. Willem's wife, Greta, would meet him at the door with desperate eyes and trembling hands. She had lost 2 children already to the pestilence, twin boys who had been the light of her world. Margot was all she had left, and Thomas could see in the woman's face that losing her daughter would surely drive her to madness. "How fares she tonight, good wife?" Thomas whispered as Greta led him up the narrow stairs. "The fever broke this afternoon, brother," she replied, her voice thick with wonder and disbelief. For the first time in days, she took some broth and spoke my name clearly. Thomas felt his heart leap with joy, though he kept his expression carefully neutral. The herbal mixture was working. The combination of cooling herbs to bring down fever, strengthened with bloodroot to purge the poison from her system. It was the 5th child who had shown such improvement under his secret ministrations. Margot lay on a straw mattress covered with her mother's finest linen, her breathing deep and regular. The terrible purple blotches that had covered her neck and armpits were fading to a pale yellow, and when Thomas placed his hand upon her forehead, he found it cool and dry. "She will live," he said simply, and Greta fell to her knees beside the bed, clutching his brown habit with both hands. "How can I ever repay you, brother? You have given me back my daughter, my life itself. Tell no one of my visits," Thomas replied gently, helping the woman to her feet. "There are those who would call this witchcraft, and both our lives would be forfeit. Let it be known only that God has shown mercy upon your house." From Margot's bedside, Thomas made his way through the sleeping village to 3 other houses, where children lay stricken with the plague. At each dwelling he found the same miraculous signs of recovery: fevers broken, the terrible swellings reduced, young voices calling for their mothers with renewed strength. At the cottage of Aldrich the blacksmith, he found 8-year-old Edmund sitting up in bed for the first time in a sennight, asking for bread and honey. The boy's recovery was perhaps the most remarkable of all, for he had been at death's very door when Thomas first began treating him. Now colour had returned to his cheeks, and his eyes were bright with returning health. "Brother Thomas," the child whispered excitedly as the monk entered the small chamber. "I dreamed of angels tonight. They had healing in their wings, just like in the stories Father Benedict tells during Mass." Thomas smiled and ruffled the boy's dark hair. "Perhaps you did see angels, young Edmund. Sometimes they work through the hands of ordinary men to accomplish God's will." As dawn approached and the monastery bells began to ring for lauds, Thomas made his way back through the mist-shrouded streets. His heart was full of quiet joy at the children's progress, but he knew that his secret ministry was becoming harder to conceal. Already, whispers had begun to spread through the village, talk of miraculous recoveries, of children snatched back from death's grasp by some invisible hand. He paused at the edge of the village square, where the ancient stone cross stood weathered and moss-covered. Kneeling in the mud, he lifted his eyes to the lightening sky and offered a silent prayer of thanksgiving. He asked for wisdom to continue his work without detection, for strength to prepare more of the healing tinctures, and for God's protection over the children he had secretly treated. The bells of the monastery grew more insistent, calling the brothers to their morning prayers. Thomas rose from his knees and hurried toward the abbey gates, his leather satchel now empty, but his heart full of purpose. He did not know that high above him, from the window of his solar in the village's ancient tower, Lord Aldwyn had been watching his nocturnal movements with growing curiosity and suspicion. The news of the miraculous recoveries spread through Millhaven like wildfire on a summer day, though none could say precisely how or why the pestilence had suddenly loosed its grip upon the village's children. In the marketplace, goodwives whispered behind their hands as they selected turnips and barley, speaking in hushed tones of divine intervention and answered prayers. Brother Thomas went about his daily duties at the monastery, with careful normalcy, tending the herb garden, copying manuscripts in the scriptorium, and joining his fellow monks for the canonical hours of prayer. But beneath his calm exterior, his heart raced with both joy and fear, as he overheard fragments of conversation that told him his secret was slowly unraveling. "'Tis a miracle, I tell you," declared goodwife Martha at the baker's stall, her weathered hands clutching a loaf of dark bread. "Young Margot was at death's door not 3 days past, and now she runs about her father's workshop as though she had never been ill at all. Aye, and Edmund the blacksmith's boy," added Hodge the miller, his flour-dusted apron catching the morning sunlight. "My own eyes beheld him yesterday, pale as parchment and breathing like a wounded bellows. Today he helps his father at the forge, pumping air with strength enough for 2 grown men." Thomas bent lower over the turnips he was examining, pulling his hood forward to shadow his face. Across the market square, he could see Father Benedict, the village priest, listening to these conversations with a deepening frown. The old priest's eyes were sharp as a hawk's, and Thomas knew that it would not be long before questions began to be asked about the sudden change in the children's fortunes. That afternoon, as Thomas knelt in the monastery garden pulling weeds from between the rows of healing herbs, he was approached by Brother Marcus, a fellow monk who served as the abbey's infirmarian. Marcus was a kind-hearted man, but Thomas knew he was also devoted to Abbot Cornelius and would report anything unusual without hesitation. "Brother Thomas," Marcus said, settling himself on a wooden stool beside the herb beds, "I have heard the strangest tales from the village today. They say that several children who were dying of the pestilence have made sudden and complete recoveries." Thomas continued his weeding, not trusting himself to look up. "God's mercy takes many forms, Brother Marcus. Perhaps the worst of the plague has finally passed." "Indeed, that may be so," Marcus replied thoughtfully. "Yet the recoveries seem selective. Only the children have been healed, while their parents and elder siblings remain stricken. It puts me in mind of the ancient stories of the healing saints, of how they could cure the innocent, while leaving the guilty to face God's judgment." That evening, after Compline had been sung, and the monastery had settled into its nighttime quiet, Thomas made his way once again into the sleeping village, but this time he was not alone. From the shadows of the abbey wall, Brother Marcus followed at a distance, his curiosity overcoming his usual obedience to the rule of silence after the final prayers. Thomas went first to the cottage of Aldrich the blacksmith, where he found not only young Edmund recovered, but also the boy's mother, Agnes, sitting up in bed and asking for food. The woman had been close to death when Thomas last saw her body ravaged by the same fever that had nearly claimed her son. Yet his herbal remedy, originally prepared only for children, seemed to work equally well on adults who were not too far gone in their sickness. "Brother Thomas," Agnes whispered, as he checked her pulse and felt her forehead, "my son tells me that you have been visiting him in secret, bringing healing where the physicians could offer only prayers for the dying." Thomas glanced toward the window nervously. "You must speak of this to no one, good wife. There are those who would see evil in what is merely God's work accomplished through humble means." From Edmund's bedside, Thomas made his way to the cooper's house, where he found Willem waiting for him in the doorway, with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "Brother, I know not how to thank you," the cooper said, gripping Thomas's hands with both of his own. "My Margot is not only recovered, but my wife Greta has also begun to mend. The fever that has plagued her these past days broke this morning, and she took nourishment for the first time in a se'nnight." As Thomas climbed the ladder to check on both patients, he was unaware that Brother Marcus crouched in the shadow of the cooper's workshop, his eyes wide with amazement as he witnessed the monk's clandestine healing ministry. When Thomas emerged from the house and continued on his rounds, Marcus followed, watching as the young monk visited house after house, bringing his mysterious remedies to the sick and dying. By the time Thomas returned to the monastery just before Lord's, Marcus had seen enough to understand the magnitude of what was occurring. The quiet monk who tended the herb garden and copied manuscripts by day was single-handedly turning back the tide of pestilence that had threatened to destroy their village. The next morning, as the brothers gathered in the chapter house for their daily meeting, Marcus struggled with his conscience. The rule of Saint Benedict called for obedience to their superior, but it also commanded them to care for the sick and show mercy to those in need. Brother Thomas was clearly violating Abbot Cornelius's explicit prohibition against attempting to cure the plague, yet his actions were saving lives in a way that prayer alone had not accomplished. During the morning meal, Marcus approached Thomas as they sat together at the long wooden table in the refectory. Speaking in the low tones permitted during meals, he said, "Brother, I know what you have been doing in the village at night." Thomas felt his blood turn to ice water in his veins, but he continued eating his bowl of barley porridge as though nothing had been said. "I followed you last evening," Marcus continued. "I saw you heal the sick with your own hands, bringing them back from death's threshold with herbs and tinctures of your own making." Finally, Thomas raised his eyes to meet those of his fellow monk. In Marcus's face, he saw not condemnation, but wonder and a deep respect. "Will you report me to the abbot?" Thomas asked quietly. Marcus was silent for a long moment, stirring his porridge thoughtfully. Finally, he shook his head. "What you are doing is the work of Christ himself, Brother Thomas. I will not be the one to stop you. But I fear that others have begun to notice. Lord Aldwyn has been asking questions in the village, and Father Benedict grows suspicious of these sudden recoveries." Thomas nodded grimly. He had known that this day would come, when his secret ministry could no longer remain hidden. The question now was whether he would be allowed to continue his work, or whether fear and superstition would triumph over mercy and healing. The knock upon the monastery gates came at dawn, sharp and commanding, echoing through the stone corridors like the voice of judgment itself. Brother Thomas was in the scriptorium, carefully grinding herbs by candlelight before the morning prayers, when he heard the commotion in the courtyard below. Through the narrow window, he could see mounted soldiers bearing the royal standard, the golden lions of King Edward upon a field of crimson. Abbot Cornelius emerged from his cell, his normally composed features creased with concern as he hurried to answer the summons. The lead knight, resplendent in mail and surcoat, dismounted and approached the abbot with a scroll bearing the royal seal. "By order of His Majesty King Edward, third of that name," the knight proclaimed, in a voice that carried across the courtyard, "we seek one Brother Thomas of this house, who is summoned to appear before the king to answer questions regarding certain unusual activities in the village of Millhaven." Thomas felt his hands grow cold as stone. His secret had not only been discovered, it had somehow reached the ears of the king himself. He set down his mortar and pestle with trembling fingers and made his way down to the courtyard, where Abbot Cornelius stood pale and shaken beside the royal messenger. "I am Brother Thomas," he said simply, stepping forward with as much dignity as he could muster. The knight studied him with calculating eyes. "You will come with us immediately. The king wishes to hear your account of these miraculous healings that have become the talk of half the realm." As Thomas gathered his few possessions and prepared to depart, Brother Marcus approached him quietly. "Be of good courage, brother," he whispered. "Word of what you have accomplished has spread far beyond our village. They say that messengers have carried news of the healings to London itself, and that the king's own physicians are eager to learn your methods." The journey to the royal castle took 3 days of hard riding, during which Thomas learned from his escorts that the story of the plague-cured children had indeed spread throughout the kingdom like ripples on a pond. Traveling merchants, pilgrims, and wandering minstrels had carried the tale from village to village, each telling growing more wondrous in the retelling. "They say you raised the dead," remarked Sir Geoffrey, the captain of the Royal Guard, as they made camp on the second night. "That children who had already been laid out for burial rose from their deathbeds at your touch." Thomas shook his head wearily. "I raised no one from the dead, Sir Geoffrey. I merely used the knowledge that God granted me to heal the sick with herbs and remedies. The children I treated were gravely ill, but they still lived when I came to them." "Perhaps," the knight replied thoughtfully. "But in times such as these, when the pestilence claims whole villages and leaves nothing but empty houses and unmarked graves, even healing the living seems miraculous enough." When they reached the royal castle on the third day, Thomas was amazed by the grandeur that surrounded him. The great stone walls rose like mountains from the earth, topped with banners that snapped and fluttered in the wind. In the courtyard, nobles in rich velvets and furs mingled with knights in polished armor, while servants in the royal livery hurried about their duties. Thomas was led through halls hung with tapestries that told the stories of ancient kings and holy saints, past chambers where courtiers whispered behind jeweled hands, until at last he stood before the great throne room doors. The herald announced his name in a voice that echoed from the vaulted ceiling, and the massive oak doors swung open to reveal the splendor within. King Edward sat upon his throne like a figure from the illuminated manuscripts Thomas knew so well, his crown catching the light from the great windows as he leaned forward to study the humble monk who approached his dais. The king was younger than Thomas had expected, perhaps 30 years of age, with keen blue eyes and a beard of reddish gold. "Approach, Brother Thomas," the king commanded, his voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber. "We would hear from your own lips the truth of these reports that have reached our ears." Thomas knelt before the throne and bowed his head. "Your Majesty, I am but a simple monk who has tried to serve God by healing the sick. If I have given offense, I beg your pardon and throw myself upon your mercy." "Rise, brother," the king said, and Thomas was surprised by the gentleness in his voice. "You are not here to face judgment, but to receive recognition. The reports we have heard speak not of offense, but of miracles. Tell us truly, how many have you healed?" Thomas stood and raised his eyes to meet those of his sovereign. "In Millhaven, Your Majesty, I treated perhaps a dozen children and half as many adults, all recovered from the pestilence by God's grace and the efficacy of certain herbal remedies I discovered in ancient texts." A murmur ran through the assembled courtiers, and Thomas saw several of the king's advisers lean forward with intense interest. At the king's right hand stood a man in physician's robes, his face alight with curiosity. "And these remedies," the king continued, "they are of your own devising. They are based upon the writings of ancient healers, Your Majesty, Greek and Roman physicians whose knowledge has been preserved in the monastery libraries. I merely translated their instructions and prepared the treatments according to their methods." King Edward rose from his throne and descended the steps of the dais, causing a ripple of movement through the court as nobles and courtiers bowed their heads. He approached Thomas directly, studying the young monk's face with those penetrating blue eyes. "Brother Thomas," the king said, placing a hand upon the monk's shoulder, "do you realize what you have accomplished? In a realm where entire villages have been swept away by this pestilence, where our greatest physicians can offer nothing but prayers and bleeding, you have actually turned back the tide of death itself." Thomas felt overwhelmed by the king's attention and the magnitude of what was being said. "Your Majesty, I sought only to help those who suffered. I never imagined that my small efforts would come to your notice." "Small efforts?" the king laughed, a sound both warm and commanding. "Brother, your small efforts have given us the first real hope we have seen since this plague began to ravage our kingdom. We hereby command you to share your knowledge with our royal physicians, that they might carry these remedies to every corner of our realm." The physician at the king's right hand stepped forward eagerly. "Your Majesty, if Brother Thomas would consent to teach us his methods, we could train healers throughout the kingdom, the lives that might be saved." But the king held up his hand for silence, his eyes never leaving Thomas's face. "There is more, good brother. We have heard tell that your healings were accomplished in secret, against the wishes of your superior. This troubles us, for it suggests that there are those who would stand in the way of such mercy." Thomas felt his cheeks burn with shame. "Abbot Cornelius believed that the pestilence was God's judgment, Your Majesty. He felt that only prayer and penance could turn aside the Almighty's wrath. And what say you to that, Brother Thomas?" Thomas took a deep breath, knowing that his answer might determine not only his own fate, but the future of healing throughout the realm. "Your Majesty, I believe that God grants us knowledge and skill so that we might use them in service to others. If he did not wish us to heal the sick, why would he have given us herbs with healing properties, or minds capable of understanding how to use them?" King Edward smiled at Thomas's words, and the warmth in that smile seemed to fill the great throne room like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The monarch turned to address his assembled court, his voice ringing with royal authority and decision. "Let it be proclaimed throughout our realm," the king declared, his words echoing from the stone walls, "that this day marks the founding of a new holy order, the Order of St. Luke, patron of physicians and healers. Brother Thomas of Millhaven shall be its first prior, and under his guidance we shall establish houses of healing in every major town and city of our kingdom." The court erupted in whispers of amazement and approval, but Thomas felt his knees grow weak with the enormity of what had just been decreed. He, a simple monk who had violated his abbot's orders to treat sick children in secret, was being elevated to lead a royal order dedicated to healing. "Your Majesty," Thomas stammered, "I am not worthy of such honor. I know only a little of the healing arts, learned from dusty manuscripts and trial in treating a few village children." King Edward placed both hands upon Thomas's shoulders, his blue eyes intense with purpose. "Brother Thomas, worthiness is not measured by what we know, but by what we are willing to do with the knowledge we possess. You risked punishment, even accusations of witchcraft, to save the lives of children. That courage and compassion are precisely what this realm needs." The king's chief physician, Master William de Montfort, stepped forward with barely contained excitement. "Prior Thomas," he said, using the new title with obvious pleasure, "if you would share your knowledge with the physicians of the realm, we could train healers to carry these remedies to every corner of the kingdom. Think of the lives that might be saved." Over the following days, Thomas found himself at the center of a whirlwind of activity. The king's scribes recorded every detail of his herbal preparations, while Master William and his colleagues tested the remedies on volunteer patients suffering from various ailments. To their amazement and joy, the treatments proved effective not only against the plague, but against fever, infection, and numerous other maladies that had long been considered incurable. Word of the new order spread throughout the kingdom with remarkable speed. Within a fortnight, young monks and priests began arriving at the castle, eager to learn the healing arts and join the Order of St. Luke. Thomas found himself teaching men who had previously known only prayers and philosophy, showing them how to identify healing herbs, prepare tinctures, and diagnose the subtle signs of different illnesses. Among the first to arrive was Brother Marcus from Thomas's own monastery, his face shining with joy and determination. "I told you I would not stand in the way of God's work," he said, embracing his fellow monk warmly. "Now I ask to stand beside you in it." The king provided the order with a great house just outside the castle walls, complete with gardens for growing medicinal herbs, laboratories for preparing remedies, and chambers where the sick could be treated. Within its walls, Thomas established the first formal school of medicine in the realm, where knowledge that had been scattered through monastery libraries was gathered, organized, and taught systematically. But perhaps the most remarkable development came when a royal messenger arrived from Millhaven, with news that made Thomas's heart sing with joy. Abbot Cornelius himself had come to the village, accompanied by Father Benedict and several other clergy, to witness firsthand the results of Thomas's healing ministry. "The abbot wishes me to convey his profound apologies," the messenger reported, kneeling before Thomas in the great hall of the order's house. "He says that he now understands that God's mercy can work through human hands as well as through prayer, and he asks your forgiveness for attempting to prevent you from following your calling." Even more wonderful was the news that followed. Not a single person in Millhaven had died of the plague since Thomas's treatments began. The village, which had been on the verge of being abandoned, was now thriving once again. Children played in the streets, the markets bustled with activity, and new families were moving in to replace those who had fled during the worst of the pestilence. As autumn turned to winter, Thomas stood in the herb garden of the order's house, watching young monks tend the plants that would become life-saving medicines. Snow dusted the carefully tended beds where wolfsbane, elderflower, and bloodroot grew in neat rows, protected by wooden frames and warming braziers. Brother Marcus approached through the falling snow, his arms full of manuscripts that had arrived from monasteries throughout the kingdom, ancient texts on healing that abbots and priors were eager to share with the new order. "Prior Thomas," Marcus said, setting down his burden carefully, "I have just received word from the king. He wishes to declare a day of celebration throughout the realm, a feast day to commemorate the founding of our order and the lives it has saved." Thomas nodded thoughtfully, his breath visible in the cold air. "And what day does His Majesty suggest?" "The Feast of St. Luke, naturally, October 18th. It seems fitting that the patron of physicians should also be the patron of our celebration." That evening, as Thomas knelt in the chapel of the Order's house for evening prayers, he reflected on the miraculous journey that had brought him from a secret midnight ministry to the leadership of a royal order dedicated to healing. The chapel was filled with the soft voices of his fellow monks, many of whom had left comfortable positions in established monasteries to join this new venture. Through the stained glass windows, colored light fell upon the altar, where a beautiful painting depicted St. Luke, traditionally shown with his symbols of physician and evangelist. But in this painting, commissioned specially for the order, the saint was shown not writing his gospel, but tending to sick children, his hands glowing with the light of divine compassion. As the final prayers were sung and the monks began to file out of the chapel, Thomas remained kneeling before the altar. His heart was full of gratitude for the knowledge that had been granted to him, for the courage to act upon it despite opposition, and for a king wise enough to recognize that healing was indeed a holy calling. The snow continued to fall outside, covering the herb gardens and the walls of the great house with a blanket of pristine white. But within those walls, the work of healing continued. Young monks studying ancient texts by candlelight, preparing medicines that would save countless lives, and carrying forward a tradition that would endure long after Thomas himself had joined the saints in glory. In the years that followed, the Order of St. Luke would establish healing houses throughout the kingdom and beyond, becoming a beacon of hope in a world too often darkened by suffering and death. But it all began with one humble monk who dared to believe that God's love could work through human hands, and who had the courage to act upon that belief even when it meant defying earthly authority. The children of Millhaven grew to adulthood healthy and strong, many of them eventually joining the order themselves to continue the work of healing that had saved their lives. And every year on the Feast of St. Luke, throughout the realm and in lands beyond, people gathered to celebrate not just the saint himself, but the miraculous day when secret compassion became public glory, and when one man's quiet ministry grew into a movement that changed the world. Thus was born the great tradition of healing that would illuminate the darkest ages, carrying forward the simple truth that Thomas had discovered in those long nights of secret ministry, that love, knowledge, and courage, working together in service to others, can accomplish miracles that echo through eternity.